The thing about absolute truth is that it becomes significantly less absolute the moment someone ignores it hard enough. For 53,000 years, give or take a few centuries depending on which calendar system you trusted, the galaxy operated under a very specific set of rules. Not suggestions, not guidelines, rules. The kind that were carved into crystalline data cores, sung in harmonic religious ceremonies, and tested in laboratory conditions so many times that the experiments themselves had become religious rituals. The doctrine of divine boundaries wasn't just science. It was better than science. It was science that had been blessed, notarized, and approved by every major theological institution across 47 star systems. The math was beautiful, elegant, and most importantly, consistent. Maximum reaction time for any carbon-based life form, around 0.47 seconds. Maximum neural processing speed, 847 calculations per second. Maximum acceleration tolerance before cellular breakdown, 23 g-forces for exactly 4.3 seconds. These weren't estimates. These were facts handed down from the precursors, those mysterious elder beings who had apparently figured everything out before mysteriously vanishing, which was convenient, because it meant nobody could ask them awkward questions about their methodology. The Quilaxians, insectoid beings whose exoskeletons reflected light in precisely 7 wavelengths that corresponded to divine frequencies, had built their entire priesthood around maintaining these measurements. The Helvrathi, towering warrior philosophers who treated combat like interpretive dance and philosophy like competitive sport, had structured their martial arts around the absolute limits of possibility. Even the Telmori, those perpetually bureaucratic bird people whose idea of excitement was a properly filed form in triplicate, had created entire governmental departments dedicated to ensuring nobody exceeded their predetermined limitations. It was a good system. It had worked for literal epochs. Species rose, species fell, but the limits remained constant, comforting, predictable, completely and utterly wrong, as it turned out. But nobody knew that yet. Enter humanity. Or more specifically, enter humanity stumbling through the galactic stage door 12 years late, without an invitation, and possibly intoxicated. First contact had been awkward. The human ship had been broadcasting what they claimed were peaceful greeting signals, but which every translation matrix in the sector identified as either a declaration of war or possibly a recipe for bread. Nobody was quite sure. The linguistic chaos had eventually been sorted out, and humanity had been welcomed into galactic civilization with the kind of polite enthusiasm usually reserved for distant relatives at family reunions. Nice enough people, these humans. Short-lived, which was sad. Technologically delayed by about 800 years, which was expected from a species that had developed in complete isolation. Their planet, which they called Earth with an almost aggressive lack of creativity, was a death world by galactic standards. But they seemed oddly proud of this fact. It builds character, one human diplomat had explained during the integration meetings. The Telmori representative had spent 40 minutes trying to file that statement under an appropriate category and eventually gave up. Humans were classified as Tier 7 contributors to galactic civilization. Not an insult, just reality. They excelled at stubbornness, improvisation, and creating food dishes that technically violated several laws of chemistry. They were given standard trade agreements, access to the educational networks, and a handful of embassy positions. Some humans, looking for adventure or possibly just rent money, signed up as contractors throughout the galaxy. Security work, mostly. The kind of jobs that required a warm body and armor and the ability to look intimidating while standing in one place for 8 hours. Reeve Malcor was one of these humans, and he was absolutely not prepared for the theological crisis he was about to cause. Station Zenith 7 orbited a gas giant in neutral space, serving as a trading hub for 14 different species and home to approximately 40,000 permanent residents. Reeve had been working security there for 7 months, and his primary responsibilities included checking credentials, responding to the occasional drunk merchant trying to sell counterfeit engine parts, and trying to figure out which of the station's 17 different cantinas served something approximating coffee. He was 32 years old, which by human standards meant he was an adult, but barely, had brown hair that needed cutting, a collection of scars from a youth spent doing inadvisable things on Earth, and the kind of build that came from manual labor, and occasionally remembering to exercise. The Quilaxians who ran the security division thought he was adequate. The Helvrathi dock workers thought he was amusingly small. The Telmori administrators thought his paperwork was sloppy but technically compliant. None of them thought he was special. This was about to change in the most inconvenient way possible. The trials of ascendancy came around every decade like clockwork, which was appropriate since the Helvrathi, who organized them, were obsessed with both clocks and tradition. It was part tournament, part religious ceremony, part cultural festival, and entirely exhausting for everyone involved. Warriors from every species would compete in combat trials, not to the death, but to the limit of their abilities, proving that their people hadn't degraded from the divine standards set forth in the doctrine. It was a big deal. Thousands attended. Millions watched on broadcast networks. Entire theological dissertations were written analyzing the performance data. Reeve had absolutely no intention of participating. He barely understood the cultural significance, and his combat experience consisted of a few self-defense classes on Earth and one memorable bar fight on Station Zenith 7 that he'd technically won by default when his opponent slipped on spilled Telmori wine. Unfortunately, the universe has a sense of humor, and that sense of humor apparently worked in the Zenith 7 administrative offices. A Telmori clerk named Vix Shatalinex Por Quintex Vashmoritek, who went by Vix because life was too short even for Telmori, had been processing security personnel certifications when his datapad glitched. In the resulting confusion, Reeve's file had been automatically entered into the trials roster. By the time anyone noticed, the registration had been blessed by 3 different priesthoods filed with the Tournament Commission and announced publicly. "Can't we just unregister me?" Reeve had asked when Security Chief Cross, a Helvrathi whose idea of a relaxed posture still looked like he was ready to fight gravity itself, informed him of the situation. "The forms have been consecrated," Cross rumbled, his 4 eyes blinking in sequence. To withdraw now would require a theological committee review, 3 character witnesses, and approximately 47 signatures across 7 different governmental bodies. Or I could just show up and lose immediately? Cross considered this. That would be simpler. Great. Do I get free lunch? There is a competitor's meal stipend, yes. I'm in. High Priestess Chixla of the Quilaxian Orthodox Measurement Ministry had been overseeing the trials for 3 decades. She took her responsibilities seriously, which for a Quilaxian meant she took them with an almost aggressive dedication that bordered on obsession. Every measurement was triple-checked. Every calculation was verified against the ancient texts. Every competitor was analyzed, categorized, and assessed for their compliance with divine limitations. When she saw the humans' registration, she barely noticed. Humans were Tier 7. Their expected performance would be adequate, but unremarkable. The preliminary calculations showed Reeve would likely be eliminated in the first round, possibly the second, if he got lucky with matchups. She filed the data and moved on to more interesting competitors. She would later describe this as the greatest oversight of her career, though oversight was probably too gentle a word for missing the impending collapse of 53,000 years of theological certainty. The first round of the trials took place in the station's main arena, a converted cargo bay that had been outfitted with force fields, weapon systems, and enough safety protocols to satisfy even Telmori insurance adjusters. The fights were non-lethal but full contact, using weapons that delivered plasma shocks calibrated to stun rather than kill. Competitors wore light armor and personal shields. The rules were simple: disable your opponent's shield, force a surrender, or wring them out of the combat zone. Reeve's first match was against a Helvrathi named Cross. Different Cross, not his boss. The Helvrathi apparently had a limited selection of names and compensated with elaborate title systems that Reeve hadn't bothered learning. This Cross was 7 feet tall, built like he'd been carved from stone by an artist who believed subtlety was for the weak, and moved with the kind of fluid grace that came from a lifetime of martial training. The match began at dawn, station time. Cross opened with a traditional Helvrathi salute, which involved several intricate hand movements and what might have been a small prayer. Reeve waved awkwardly and activated his shield. "You honor me with your presence, small warrior," Cross rumbled, in the formal combat dialect that translators struggled to render naturally. "Thanks. You seem nice." "Sorry about this," Reeve replied, which the translator rendered as something approximately polite but grammatically concerning. Cross attacked with textbook precision. A feint to the left, a plasma strike to the right, calculated to force Reeve into a defensive position where a follow-up strike would disable his shield. According to every combat model in the database, the attack sequence would take 1.3 seconds to execute and was essentially undodgeable for a human. Reeve dodged it. Not elegantly, not with any particular style. He just moved, his body reacting before his conscious mind had finished processing the threat. One moment he was in the strike path, the next he was 2 feet to the left, looking mildly surprised at his own relocation. Cross paused. That was odd. He recalculated and launched a combination strike, this one even faster, optimized for the human's new position. Reeve ducked under it, stumbled slightly, and accidentally ended up in a position that any combat instructor would have called tactically advantageous, but which Reeve had arrived at through a combination of instinct and mild panic. The match continued for 3 minutes. Cross landed several solid hits, and Reeve's shield failed halfway through. By all rights, that should have ended it. Instead, Reeve spent the remaining 90 seconds dodging follow-up strikes through what appeared to be a combination of luck, reflexes, and the kind of spatial awareness that shouldn't have been possible for someone who claimed he'd learned to fight from watching movies and getting into stupid arguments. When Cross finally landed a stunning blow that ended the match, he stood over the human's twitching form with a growing sense of unease. The match data was already being transmitted to the judges. 3 of his strikes had been perfectly executed, textbook maneuvers that were supposed to be physically impossible to evade. The human had evaded 2 of them. Luck, Cross told himself, helping Reeve to his feet once the stun wore off. Random chance. Statistical anomaly. In the judge's booth, High Priestess Chixla stared at her instruments with mounting concern. The human's reaction time during that sequence had measured at 0.041 seconds. That was impossible. The instruments must have glitched. She made a note to have them recalibrated and moved on to the next match. The thing about impossible things is that they become significantly harder to ignore when they keep happening. Reeve advanced to the second round by what everyone agreed was extraordinary luck. His opponent had accidentally stepped out of bounds while attempting a finishing move. Could have happened to anyone. Round 3 saw Reeve facing a Telmori fighter whose strategy involved calculated patience and precise timing. Reeve won when he somehow predicted a strike pattern that the Tel Mori had literally invented that morning and had never used in competition before. "I don't know," Reeve explained when asked about his tactical genius. "He looked like he was going to go left, so I moved right." But the statistical analysis of his previous 14 matches indicated an 87% probability of a right-side attack, the confused interviewer pressed. "Sure, but he was definitely going left. You could see it in his shoulders." This explanation satisfied no one. But Reeve was already walking away to find food. So the interview ended there. By round 5, people were paying attention. Not because Reeve was winning. He'd lost round 4 and only advanced because his opponent had to withdraw with an injury from a previous match. But because the data coming from his matches was increasingly problematic. Frame-by-frame analysis showed reaction times that danced right along the theoretical limits. Sometimes they exceeded those limits, but only by margins so small they could be attributed to measurement error. Except measurement error shouldn't consistently favor one direction. And Reeve's errors were always the same. Faster than possible, never slower. Scientists began requesting additional sensor data. Religious officials began quietly suggesting that perhaps the sensors were unreliable. A theological committee was convened, then quietly disbanded when their preliminary findings were too disturbing to formalize. The trials continued, and everyone agreed not to talk about the growing elephant in the arena. That elephant was about to become significantly harder to ignore. The semi-final matches were held in the Grand Arena, a proper stadium built into the station's central hub with seating for 5,000 spectators and broadcast coverage that reached 40 systems. Reeve's opponent was a Quilaxian warrior priest named Zixtal, who had trained since hatching in the sacred combat monasteries and whose movements were so precise they were used as reference standards for teaching students about divine limitations. The match was scheduled for midday, station time. The arena was packed. High Priestess Chixla sat in the honored observers section, her instruments arrayed before her, determined to finally get clean data that would disprove the mounting anomalies. Cross, the security chief version, sat nearby, having been given the day off to watch his employees' improbable tournament run. Several hundred others filled the stands, including a delegation of Tel Mori officials who had brought clipboards and were taking extensive notes. Reeve entered the arena looking like he'd rather be literally anywhere else. His armor was slightly crooked. His hair was definitely too long. He waved at someone in the crowd, who turned out to be waving at someone behind him, creating a brief moment of awkwardness that the broadcast cameras captured in uncomfortable detail. Zixtal entered with appropriate ceremony, his exoskeleton polished to mirror brightness, his movements economical and precise. The pre-match blessing was conducted. The weapons were activated. The match began. What happened next would be analyzed for years, debated in theological circles, and eventually lead to the reformation of 3 major religions and the complete overhaul of galactic physics textbooks. The match itself was unremarkable for the first 90 seconds. Zixtal was methodical, testing Reeve's defenses, probing for weaknesses. Reeve was defensive, dodging more than attacking, clearly outmatched, but stubbornly refusing to go down easy. The crowd watched with polite interest. This would be over soon, and then the real final match could begin. Then the plasma cannon malfunctioned. Arena weapons were maintained to absurd standards. Failure rates were less than 0.001%. Safety systems had safety systems. What happened was so statistically improbable that the investigation afterward would conclude it required 3 separate systems to fail simultaneously in exactly the wrong sequence. One of the arena's perimeter defense cannons, which were supposed to be completely inactive during matches, experienced a catastrophic power surge. The safety interlocks failed, The targeting system defaulted to an error state that interpreted the spectator section as a valid target zone. And the weapon fired at full lethal capacity, sending a plasma bolt the size of a human fist screaming toward the stands at roughly 3,000 meters per second. The crowd had 0.73 seconds before impact. Long enough for some people to register that something was wrong. Not long enough to react. Not nearly long enough. Reeve was the closest competitor to the bolt's trajectory. He was also mid-dodge from one of Zixtal's strikes, his weight on his back foot, his shield already depleted from a hit 2 seconds earlier. By every calculation, every physical law, every divine limitation, he should have been able to do nothing. At best, he might have been able to turn his head to watch the tragedy unfold. Instead, he moved. Later analysis would show that his reaction time from bolt firing to movement initiation was 0.008 seconds. His acceleration from standing to full sprint was 43 g-forces sustained for 0.6 seconds. His trajectory calculation, which required him to intercept a plasma bolt moving at supersonic speeds while accounting for his own momentum. The bolt's vector and the optimal angle for deflection involved approximately 8,400 individual calculations performed in less time than it took for the neurons in a Quillaxian's brain to fire once. The crowd saw a blur. The high-speed cameras, recording at 10,000 frames per second, captured something that resembled movement but seemed to skip frames, as if reality itself had hiccuped. Reeve crossed the arena floor, reached the bolt's trajectory, and caught it. Not with a tool, not with a shield, with his hand. More specifically, with his palm, fingers spread, arm angled at precisely 34 degrees from vertical, body rotating to absorb and redirect the plasma's momentum. The bolt, which carried enough energy to vaporize a Telmori and severely injure most other species, hit his unshielded, unarmored hand and stopped. For exactly 0.003 seconds, Reeve held a ball of superheated plasma in his bare hand, while his nervous system screamed, his skin began to char, and his brain calmly completed the calculations for the redirection vector. Then he threw it. Not at anyone. At the arena's emergency containment field emitter, a system designed to capture malfunctioning weapons fire. The bolt streaked across the arena, hit the emitter's capture field, and dissipated harmlessly in a shower of sparks and the smell of ozone. Reeve stood in the center of the arena, his hands smoking, his face displaying an expression that could best be described as confused about what just happened, but also his hand really hurt. The arena was completely silent. 5,000 beings sat frozen, their minds struggling to process what they'd just witnessed. In the judge's booth, High Priestess Chixla stared at her instruments. Every sensor had recorded the event. Every measurement was clear, verified, and completely impossible. The numbers couldn't be real. They violated everything. The doctrine of divine boundaries wasn't just wrong. It was catastrophically, fundamentally, almost offensively wrong. Her hands trembled as she ran the calculations again, and again, and again. The numbers didn't change. 0.008 seconds, 43 g-forces, 8,400 calculations. And most damning of all, the human's body temperature, blood pressure, and neural activity indicated this wasn't even his maximum capacity. He'd been operating at approximately 60% of his potential, limited not by divine boundaries, but by the simple fact that he'd been surprised and hadn't had time to fully commit to the movement. "Blessed precursors," she whispered, her translation implant struggling to find appropriate words in any language. "What are these creatures?" The arena remained silent for another 10 seconds. Then someone started clapping. Slowly, uncertainly, the applause built, not because anyone understood what they'd seen, but because in the absence of understanding, social ritual provided comfort. The match was called. Reeve was declared the winner by default and immediately disqualified from the finals for medical necessity, which was the closest thing the rules had to "we need to study what just happened." Reeve was escorted to the medical bay, where his hand was treated for second-degree burns that should have been fourth-degree annihilation. The doctors, representing 4 different species, examined him with the kind of fascination usually reserved for undiscovered phenomena or particularly interesting mold samples. "Does that happen often?" a Telmori doctor asked, scanning Reeve's neural patterns for the 7th time. "What? Burning my hand?" "Not usually. Caught a pan wrong once when I was cooking." "Not the burn, the doctor gestured vaguely at everything. "The movement, the speed, all of it." "Oh, I played baseball in school. You kind of have to react fast or you get hit in the face with the ball." "How fast does this ball move?" "Depends. Professional pitchers can throw maybe 90, 95 miles per hour." The doctor did a quick calculation. "That's approximately 40 meters per second." "Sure. And humans react to and intercept this regularly?" Not me specifically. I was terrible at baseball. But yeah, lots of people can." The doctor excused himself and went to have a quiet existential crisis in the supply closet. The theological crisis began approximately 40 minutes after the incident, which was actually impressive restraint by religious institution standards. High Priestess Chixla called an emergency convocation of the Measurement Ministry. Representatives from the Helvrathi warrior philosopher temples and the Telmori Bureau of Physical Standards were invited. The meeting was closed to the public, which only made the rumors spread faster. The evidence was undeniable. The human had exceeded the divine limitations. Not by a little. Not through some technicality or measurement error. By a factor that made the limitations look less like laws of nature and more like gentle suggestions that nature had decided to ignore. The implications were staggering. If humans could exceed the limits, could other species? Had they been artificially restricting themselves for 53,000 years, based on incorrect data? Were the precursors wrong, or had they lied? Or had everyone simply misunderstood? Perhaps, one elderly Helvrathi philosopher suggested carefully, the doctrine describes average limitations, and this human is exceptional. We tested their entire species during integration, Chixla replied, her voice strained. Their average reaction time is 0.25 seconds, slower than ours, slower than everyone's. This individual tested at 0.26 seconds during his standard security certification. These current measurements are impossible. Then perhaps, a Telmori bureaucrat said with the careful tone of someone delivering very bad news, the testing conditions were wrong. Silence fell over the meeting. Because that was the real horror, wasn't it? Not that the human was exceptional, but that the human was normal, and everyone had been testing under conditions that didn't actually stress the limits. Combat conditions. Life or death conditions. The conditions that actually mattered. An investigation was launched. Quietly, because launching theological investigations loudly tended to cause panic. Scientists were dispatched to Earth, that awful death world where humans came from. They studied human evolution, human history, human biology. What they found was deeply uncomfortable. Earth was a nightmare. The investigation team filed reports that read like horror stories. Predators everywhere. Prey animals that could kill you just as easily as predatory ones. Plants that were poisonous. Weather that could kill you in dozens of creative ways. Diseases, parasites, geological instability, and a gravity that was 20% higher than galactic standard. Humans had evolved on a planet that was actively trying to kill them. And they'd survived not through natural weapons or armor, but through one simple evolutionary strategy: be faster than you should be, or die. Natural selection didn't care about divine mathematical limits. Natural selection cared about results. For millions of years, humans who couldn't react fast enough were removed from the gene pool by tigers, bears, snakes, rival humans, falling rocks, poisonous plants, and approximately 8,000 other hazards. The ones who survived passed on genes for faster reflexes, better spatial processing, more efficient neural pathways. Generation after generation, the baseline kept climbing because the alternative was extinction. And then humans developed civilization and the selection pressure eased. They got slower, more comfortable. Their tested reaction time of 0.25 seconds was real for normal conditions, safe conditions, conditions where their ancient survival systems were dormant, sleeping, waiting for the moment when death came screaming and the body remembered what it was built to do. The galaxy's other species had evolved on safer worlds, worlds that had been guided by precursor intervention, shaped to be habitable, protected. They developed intelligence and civilization without the same desperate edge. Their limits were real, but they were the limits of beings who'd never needed to exceed them. They'd been given the doctrine as a gift, a way to understand their capabilities. And they'd assumed it was universal. Humans had evolved in the absence of divine mercy. They'd built their capabilities on a foundation of absolute survival necessity. And nobody had thought to test what happened when you pushed a human into a life-or-death situation. Because by the time anyone met them, humans had forgotten what they were capable of too. The report was filed. The evidence was reviewed. The theological committees met for weeks. The conclusions were unavoidable and deeply embarrassing for everyone involved. The doctrine of divine boundaries was revised. Amended, technically, though completely rewritten while trying to preserve institutional dignity was more accurate. The new version included numerous footnotes, exceptions, and a carefully worded section that essentially said, "Limitations are contextual and subject to environmental evolutionary pressures. Please consult with your species-specific data and don't assume universality." It was the most significant theological revision in galactic history, and it was very politely not called the human exception, even though everyone knew that's what it was. 3 months after the incident, Station Zenith 7 had returned to normal operations, sort of. There were new signs posted throughout the facility. Divine limits are provisional. Manage expectations accordingly. The trials of ascendancy had been postponed indefinitely, while the rules were rewritten to account for species-specific capabilities that might exceed previous understood limitations. Reeve returned to security work. His hand had healed completely, which had surprised the doctors, but probably shouldn't have. He was assigned to the same checkpoints, given the same boring responsibilities, and paid the same adequate salary. The only difference was that other species now gave him slightly more space in corridors, and sometimes he caught them watching him with the kind of wary respect usually reserved for unexploded ordnance. High Priestess Chixla had founded a new theological movement called the Doctrine of Adaptive Divinity, which argued that the divine plan was more flexible than previously understood, and that limitations were meant to be understood rather than worshipped. It was gaining followers, mostly among younger clergy who appreciated the intellectual honesty. She still occasionally sent research requests to Reeve, asking him to perform various physical tests. He usually ignored them because they arrived during his work shifts and he had credentials to check. Other species had begun tentatively exploring their own limitations under stress conditions. The results were mixed. A few Helvrathi discovered they could exceed previous strength benchmarks when properly motivated. Some Telmori found that their calculation speeds increased during genuine emergency situations. Most species, however, remained comfortable within their tested ranges because evolutionary pressure wasn't something you could just decide to overcome through willpower and curiosity. Humans, meanwhile, had become simultaneously more respected and more unsettling to galactic civilization. Research into human capabilities continued. Earth was reclassified from death world to extreme evolutionary pressure environment. Human contractors found themselves in higher demand, particularly for high-risk positions. The combat sports industry was having heated debates about whether humans should be allowed to compete in mixed species tournaments or if they needed their own category. On a random Tuesday afternoon, station time, Reeve sat at his checkpoint reviewing credential files on his datapad. The shift was quiet. A merchant passed through, credentials verified. A Telmori family on vacation, documents approved. A maintenance worker with a cart full of supplies waved through after inspection. Reeve yawned and reached for his coffee. His hand missed the cup. It tipped, began to fall. His reflexes kicked in before his conscious mind registered the problem. His hand blurred, caught the cup 6 inches above the desk, didn't spill a drop. He set it down properly and went back to his datapad without really thinking about what he'd done. Across the checkpoint area, High Priestess Chixla stood frozen, her instruments recording, her mind calculating the reaction time she'd just witnessed. 0.009 seconds. For coffee. For a completely trivial domestic accident. The human had moved at superhuman speeds to prevent a minor inconvenience, and he hadn't even noticed. She made another note in her research file. Added another data point to the growing mountain of evidence. Recalculated her entire theological framework one more time. The divine plan, she had concluded, had a sense of humor. It had spent 53,000 years letting the galaxy believe in comfortable limitations, in knowable boundaries, in a universe that made sense. And then it had introduced humans, who had evolved in the absence of divine guidance and had accidentally become exactly the kind of impossible that made everyone else reconsider everything they thought they knew. The gods hadn't lied about limits, she decided. They'd just never met a species stupid enough, stubborn enough, or desperate enough to ignore them. And in ignoring them, humans had broken them. Not through malice or intention, but through the simple evolutionary logic of move faster or die, repeated across millions of years until it became genetic memory. Chixla saved her files, closed her instruments, and walked away. She had a theological paper to write. Several, actually. This would keep her busy for decades. Behind her, Reeve finished his coffee, filed his reports, and counted down the hours until his shift ended. He had dinner plans with some co-workers. They were going to that Telmori place on level 7. He hoped they served something that tasted like actual food. He was hungry. Somewhere in the divine cosmic plan, something that might have been gods or precursors, or just the universe's sense of irony, was probably laughing.